Well, hello to everyone tuning in on Zoom and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I am Robin Browne and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I'm joined tonight by my regular co-host, Libby Davies.
Well, thank you, Robin, and hello, everybody. I'm Libby Davies, and I'm joining you from the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Coast Salish peoples.
All right. Thank you, Libby. Well, the federal budget was announced yesterday called Fairness for Every Generation. It's got chapters on making housing more affordable, lowering the cost of living, making communities safer and healthier, a fair future for Indigenous people, and much more. So today, we've gathered an expert crew to deconstruct this budget and wonder aloud what these promises will mean for the upcoming year. Here to join us are economist at the Center for Future Work, Jim Stanford, senior economist at the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, David Macdonald, and coming back and joining us, writer and policy researcher Chuka Ejeckam. Welcome, everyone. And welcome to everyone joining us on Zoom. We encourage you to participate in the chat and polls and to ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function. And as always, we'll do our best to address your questions. And now I'll pass it over to Libby to get the conversation started.
Okay, well, another federal budget. We've done quite a few now, Robin, haven't we? So I'm going to start with a question for all of our three panelists. And let's begin with, Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, said 2 weeks ago, before the budget was released yesterday, that this would be, quote, unlock pathways to a good middle-class life for the next generation, end of quote. Well, now we know what the budget looks like, having heard it yesterday. So I guess my question to you is, what do you think? Will this budget make life more affordable for working Canadians? Jim, let's begin with you, and then we'll go to David and then Chuka.
Thank you, Libby, and thanks to Rabble for your fine coverage of the budget, including, if I can say, a commentary written by myself today that's on the Rabble site, and other great analysis. That was my self-promotion moment. Well, Chrystia Freeland invokes the famous term middle-class Canadians. She probably said hard-working middle-class Canadians. She probably meant hardworking, deserving, key voter middle-class Canadians. It's a bit nauseating how they try to promote this. On the other hand, to be fair, the budget does contain a number of measures that absolutely are going to make a difference in the lives of what I would define as working-class Canadians, as working and low-income Canadians. A suite of measures. Not one of them is a magic bullet. And they are not going to solve the cost of living crisis facing Canadians. I've been arguing that we need to remember it isn't government that caused this cost of living crisis. It's the private sector economy. It's businesses that charge too much for what they sell and don't pay enough so that workers can afford to buy back what they've produced. And so in that regard, expecting government to solve the cost of living crisis with any of these measures is in a way misplaced. And I think we do need to keep the main critical attention on the role of businesses, especially large corporations, in fomenting this moment. Again, that being said, I do think the incremental measures in this budget will push in the right direction. And I think most Canadians will benefit from one or more of the different things in the budget, whether it's the housing supports, pharmacare and dental care, negotiated, of course, by the NDP, the expanded student loans and grants for university and college students, the free lunches for school students as that program rolls out, the new Canada Disability Benefit as it rolls out. Those are all important, valuable things that will make an incremental difference, and in that regard should be welcomed.
Just before I go to David, maybe I could sort of flip the question over, Jim. Mm-hmm. So you've named some of the kind of more popular items that might resonate with people and might take us in a better direction. What about on the other side? I remember reading something about the capital. I forget what it was. The capital gains tax, that it sort of made it a better, like our corporate tax level is still even way behind the US. Even Joe Biden has done a far better job of it. I think they're at 28%. We're still at 21% or something like that. So if we just sort of flip it the other way, any comment on sort of what the budget did on that side of things?
On the revenue side, if you
Yeah.
like, sure.
Yeah.
So there is some new spending. It's not enormous new spending. Never mind what Mr. Polyev or the C.D. Howe Institute or the Business Council are saying about opening the spending taps. Not remotely the case, but there is significant new spending. And the interesting point is they achieved that with no change at all in the deficit timetable. In fact, they're almost identical to what was in the budget last year. So Minister Freeland did keep her promise to stick to those targets, and the deficit is shrinking gradually over time and as a share of our GDP as well. How did they do that? Well, they paid for it with new revenue. And really, there was only one major new revenue policy announced in the budget, and that is the change in what's called the inclusion rate for capital gains.
Right.
Capital gains is when you profit by buying low, selling high. You haven't done any work, right? You haven't produced anything. All you did was sell something for more than you paid for it. And in fact, if you're into derivatives, you can buy high and sell low and make money off of shorting the stock. So, you know, again, there's no productive direct function to capital gains. It's just a way of rewarding people who own financial wealth. And not surprisingly, the vast majority of capital gains are claimed by the very richest segment of society. So I think the government did a very clever job of tailoring this capital gains change. There are only 40,000 Canadians who will pay more on their individual personal income tax because of it. The richest, not 1%, 0.1% of Canadians will be affected by it because of how they've designed the exemption. And they'll now have to pay tax on 2/3 of their income instead of capital gains income, instead of just half at present. And that, by the way, that's still less than workers have to pay. Okay, so if you flip burgers at McDonald's for your living, you have to include all of your income. If you flip stocks and bonds, even with this change, you only have to incur 2/3. So all the whining from corporate Canada about this is nauseating and should be repulsed, really. And I think it does raise significant money, and it does something that progressives have called for many, many years, to close down that loophole, which is absolutely just a giveaway for people with wealth.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Jim. And now over to David, just your sort of take on the budget in terms of what was put out there a couple of weeks ago and what we actually saw. And if you want to also sort of address the revenue side in terms of, you know, should it have gone further in terms of raising revenue, in terms of the capital gains? Any thoughts you have on that? So yeah, let's hear what your perspective is.
Yeah, on the capital gains, I mean, it's really actually quite surprising, the response in the business press that this is the worst budget that Canada has ever passed in its history because the wealthiest 40,000 people have to pay they get slightly less discount on their taxes than they got last year. Everyone's going to leave the country. The tech sector is going to evaporate. This must be canceled at all costs. And what's interesting is they may well win. I mean, this is what's interesting about this, right? Is that the explosion in opposition in the business press and the fear mongering that's occurred for people who on average are making $1.4 million and will be asked to pay what will get a slightly smaller discount on their taxes than they got at present. And they get 2 months grace, right? So they can sell all their stocks tomorrow and buy them all again the next day. And stay at the 50% inclusion rate instead of the higher rate that's going to occur in June. And that this is the worst budget in Canadian history. It's pretty surprising, actually. Well, maybe it's not that surprising. But really, the opposition is quite stunning, frankly. The other piece that's interesting is I'm not sure who the rich think should pay for the housing crisis and to fix it. This budget is doing a fair amount on the housing file. I think with the money in the fiscal framework at this point, we're approaching the scale of the affordability crisis on the housing. This is heavily focused on the rental side, on rental construction. That's exactly where it should be focused. There are definitely things that we could do that would result in faster changes in rent that I think are politically unpopular and are not being done. But in terms of the build side, I mean, we're getting close federally. We're not going to see the impact for a couple of years. I mean, that's worth pointing out too. So the fruits of the labor of this budget will be enjoyed by the next government, whoever that government happens to be. But who should pay for these housing programs, right? Should it be the wealthy that benefited from these housing programs because their real estate portfolio exploded in value? Should they pay a little bit more in taxes as a result of this? Should their reduction in taxes be slightly less? Or should it be the regular Canadians who are getting killed by the affordability crisis in the housing front? And so, I think this is going to be a fascinating debate to see over the course of, it's just heating up. Like, it's just starting. The business press, this was a complete surprise. I mean, this is worth pointing out, is it was a complete surprise, particularly to the business sector. It's not only, it's certainly on the individual side where you've got these 40,000 very rich Canadians that will incur this tax. The other 40 million Canadians are never going to pay it. You're just, if you've got a stock portfolio as an individual, you've got some retirement savings, that's all going to be protected. Doesn't apply to primary residences. It only applies if you're trading substantial amounts of stocks and bonds or selling companies. But it also applies on the corporate side. So corporations also incur capital gains, and they will also have to pay. Well, it's not that they'll have to pay more, they will, but their discount is smaller on their taxes. They will still pay less than if compared to another company that's making money by selling goods and services. The company that's making money trading assets will still pay less on that same amount of income. But they're very upset that discount has been reduced. And so we're seeing it on the corporate side as well, just this huge explosion of opposition to this measure, which is very targeted. And that's one of the issues with targeting wealth at the very high end, is that these are absolutely the people who should be paying it. The trouble is they are extraordinarily motivated and they have the means to make change because they can hire the best tax lawyers, they can hire the best lobbyists, they can hire the best accountants, and they can go to every single MP meeting till the end of time and scaremonger this till the cows come home in a way that no one else can, because they're that motivated, because they have to pay for it, right? And it doesn't matter for them that it goes to this housing. We think of housing as sort of an individual problem. Renters are trying to go out to get a house, rent a place and whatnot, and these housing costs are extremely high. It's a serious business problem as well. I mean, the business press doesn't realize this, but it's tough to get workers because they can't live downtown anymore in the big cities. And they're certainly not going to move to downtown Toronto or Vancouver from outside of the country to pay extraordinary costs to buy or to rent in these big cities. It's a huge unrecognized issue in the business sector that folks don't recognize. Unfortunately, the business sector just doesn't recognize this is a huge issue for them, unfortunately. So that's on the capital gains piece. I don't think this is over. This is not a done deal. I mean, the motivation on the corporate and wealthy individual side is just started to oppose this, and so we'll see whether they're successful. Technically, it comes into place on June 15th, but it really doesn't come into play until the end of the fiscal year, and when you have to file your taxes. So that's going to be, an end of April next year is when the real kind of deadline for this occurs. So we'll see whether it actually ever ends up going through without changes and a bunch of exemptions for the richest Canadians. They have the means to argue for that, and they will absolutely argue come tooth or nail. In terms of broader affordability, I think that, certainly housing, and we're going to talk about housing a bit more. I'd say we're now approaching the level of ambition that's required to have an impact here, but it's going to be a couple of years away because it's really focused on the build side. Now, that's not a bad approach, but it is focused on the build side. Some of the shorter term measures that have gotten really good take up are not the programs that got a ton of new funding this time around. So there is a new measure called the rental. What is it called here? It is called the Rental Protection Fund, which is one of the means that government is providing a pool of loans and grants to nonprofit housing providers to outbid private investors for existing apartment buildings. So, apartment buildings are always up for sale in a big city. They're always changing hands. And this is a way that, nonprofit providers can scoop those out of the for-profit market, scoop it out of the hands of private investors who would jack the rent up and keep rents lower. The trouble is, like a previous program, the Rapid Housing Initiative, it'll be heavily oversubscribed. So housing providers will love it and they'll try to use it, but they'll just flood the first window with applications, and so it won't go very far, I don't think, in terms of actually affecting rent costs right now. The other big things that'll have an impact on housing affordability is lower interest rates. One of the reasons why housing is so unaffordable is because interest rates are high. We are in this weird circumstance where high interest rates are causing high inflation because housing affordability has been such an important driver of CPI. It's so overwhelming in terms of driving inflation. And look, the other big piece is rent controls. Closing rent control loopholes as they presently exist at the provincial level, or implementing them at all. I mean, you have provinces like Alberta that have no rent controls whatsoever. These are ways that you could have a more rapid impact on rental costs. But the federal government is not interested in touching this with a 10-foot pole.
Mhm.
They do have this. They do have this renters' bill of rights that they're going to try to buy their way. They're going to try to buy their way to better regulation through a new $5 billion fund for the provinces. You're going to try to encourage the provinces to take this money, but also implement the Renters' Bill of Rights. Renters' Bill of Rights could have some limits on increases in rent, but it doesn't at present. So, I mean, a lot of folks advocate for it, but this is the trouble, is that when you start talking about renters and limiting the potential profit of investors, no one's interested all of a sudden in housing affordability, right? It's one of the real touchy subjects in Canada.
Well, I think you've hit on a very key point, and that is, it's who wins the narrative as well, right? As you say, the business community, the corporate community sort of explodes in their opposition, and they have huge influence and connections in the corporate media, which is why we like to do sort of, progressive independent media analysis here on rabble.ca to look at a budget. But yeah, I mean, considering the number of people impacted, but their impact on the broader public discourse is probably going to be huge, way out of proportion in terms of what they should be paying. So I think that demonstrates a very good point about, a budget is also about a narrative and who's winning that narrative. And I guess we'll see what happens. Just bringing in Chuka now. Chuka, I'm sure you have a very good perspective on the budget in terms of who got helped, who didn't, whether or not these commitments feel real to you or not, what we can see from that. So feel free to jump in and tell us what you think.
Yeah, I mean, while acknowledging what David and Jim have said about how particular measures will help people in particular circumstances, I do think there is still the fundamental problem that the government treats the market and treats a wage labor market or commodity markets or what have you, dominated by profiteers, as though it were a fundamental law of the universe, as opposed to being something that's ultimately subject to law, regulation, and governance. So, whether it's the cost of housing or the cost of groceries or whatnot, in all of these circumstances, there are not only major profiteers, but also profiteers who at very least collude, if not openly, or if not directly coordinate. All of them have interests that are aligned. And so opposing any attempt by government to reduce their ability to extract profit from people's lives. And I think in particular, when we're talking about groceries and housing, these are things without which you will die. The idea that others are allowed to profit simply from the fact of your existence, I think reflects a deeply unserious posture toward policymaking. And given that the government is intent upon imagining this sort of profit-dominated structure of society as immovable or unchangeable, then its only way to attempt to create change is by seeking to incentivize profiteers in some way or another, usually by granting them public money, whether it's directly through rebates or for changes in whatever their production processes or what have you. I mean, it ends up being based on the industry, but ultimately, even in the circumstance that you raised, David, where the government can give a grant to a non-profit property owner so that they can bid against for-profit property owners. If the person who sell, or if the entity that's selling the property is seeking profit, then that non-profit property owner is still having to bid against for-profit property owners who. So even if the for-profit property owner doesn't get it ultimately, they are still determining the amount of public money that is being used, and both the competing bidders and the person who's owning the property. And this is these are not solutions, right? Like these are attempts to minimize the damage of the problem, but we live in a circumstance in which everything in our society is subject to the whims of profiteers. Like, not only is that impractical, as we see in the oil and gas sector, it is literally terminal. We cannot progress as a society until we succeed in preventing profiteers from determining the course of our civilization, which we have failed to do. Obviously, it's not, certainly it's not as simple as voting for it. I understand that, but this, I think this is the fundamental problem, that it appears in housing, it appears in education, it appears in access to food, healthcare, all of these things. And even without discussing decommodification, which I understand is verboten in this hemisphere, the government can control prices. The government can even take possession of properties if necessary. The government can declare public emergencies and crises. I think there's reason to contend the affordability of housing, the lack of access to housing, is a crisis in many ways.
So even within the parameters of sort of operating in the marketplace, I take it you don't see anything sort of structural in the budget that has, and it's sort of a tweak here, a tweak there, a few kind of goodies, but there's nothing structural that hits you in terms of a change that would move us forward in a progressive way, right?
Yeah, I would say I don't think that I also agree that with David, that I don't think the government has appetite for it, whether they think it's politically unfeasible or whether they're theologically opposed to it. Who can say? But certainly it's not something that they consider seriously.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Chuka. Thanks, folks. Well, you've actually hit on or at least a good chunk of our next question, and that is, has the budget done enough to address the climate and housing crisis? So David just got into that a lot. So let's go, this time we're going to go Jim, Chuka, David. And again, the question is, has the budget done enough to address the climate and housing crises?
As far as I can see, there wasn't a whole lot in this budget about climate. Certainly nothing new. Now, the government has done a lot on climate policy in the past, in previous budgets. Last year's budget was kind of a climate budget with all of the incentives for investment in renewable energy projects and electric vehicles and battery making and all that stuff. To try and kind of keep pace with the Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and all the huge measures that it has around renewable energy. This year, frankly, I'd be hard pressed to say if there was anything in it, but David or Chuka might know. On the housing front, I tend to agree with David that taken as a whole, there's got to be 15 or 20 different things that are part of that Canada Housing Plan that was announced the Friday before the budget. And, they're all significant. They're all pushing in different directions on the problem. Chuka's 100% right that, most of it takes for granted the power of private land ownership and private developers over the housing industry. And I think there's a whole challenge for the left in this regard to expose why we have a housing crisis better. I was engaged in some great conversations last week with John Cartwright, former president of the Labour Council in Toronto, and now I think chairperson of the Council of Canadians, who's really doing creative thinking about how do we change Poilievre's narrative that the housing crisis is all due to the so-called gatekeepers, and we just have to free up development and then we'll all be fine. And that includes documenting and highlighting the role of private profit in creating the housing crisis. And it's not just, Joe Blow greedy landlord renting out the second house that they own. That's part of the problem for sure. But big money in property development, big money in construction, big money in banking, and the profits that have been made off mortgage lending to inflate the housing bubble. 50 to 60 billion a year profit in the real estate sector, 30 to 40 billion a year profit in construction, 50 and more in mortgage banking and other basic banking. So highlighting the vested interest there, and then finding ways to circumvent the power of markets in housing. And this is the generic demand for non-market housing in all of its forms, to sort of cut the links around speculative ownership of land and property, and actually build houses that are something to live in rather than financial assets to buy and sell. And, you know, there's some steps towards that as part of this plan. The use of Canada lands for housing development, especially with them not being sold to private developers, but actually maintained in public ownership and then developed on them, is one example. Converting, I love this idea of converting underutilized federal offices into apartments, especially, again, if they remain in public ownership. So those are some of the things. Interesting, another aspect of the housing thing was how many of those 15 to 20 ideas, Libby, were cut and pasted from what the NDP government in BC is doing. You see David Eby's fingerprints all over this federal housing plan. So that's another kind of indirect compliment to, I think, some positive thinking in British Columbia on that. So on the whole, though, Chuka's judgment that this is just trying to help Canadians deal with a problem without addressing the structural causes of that problem is 100% correct.
Great, thanks, Jake. Chuka, again, just for folks who might join us, has the budget done enough to address the climate and housing crises?
Well, I answered the last question by talking a bit about how profiteers are going to kill us all and governments will stand happily by watching. So I won't answer this one that way. But I do think in relation to the question of climate, there are specific things that are notable in that I would say the government is either not serious about the problem or misunderstanding the degree to which the public takes the problem seriously, in particular, young people. So as Jim mentioned, the government in recent years has made a significant amount of, or has drawn significant attention to its attempt to set up an electric vehicle battery production chain in Canada. And both in terms of increasing the prevalence and purchase of electric vehicles within Canada, but then also seeking to make Canada a significant international dealer of electric vehicles, or of electric vehicle batteries. At very least, that seems from the outside to be the objective. I would say that misunderstands the problem to a degree or misperceives the public's interest in the problem, because I would say the people who are concerned about climate are also concerned seriously about environmental justice. And they take issue. I think that the same politics that take issue with oil and gas companies for the damage that they've wrought in the world also takes issue with mining companies, and particularly with Canada's relationship to the mining industry. And the electric vehicle battery production industry is deeply involved in very rapacious mining operations in the DRC, and which have egregious impacts on the people living there and on the environment. And so, I think that a government that is seeking to address the public's demand for climate policy by pointing to electric vehicles I don't think that they're fundamentally addressing the public's demand for real policy. Now, if they genuinely think that this is a solution, then I think that they've misunderstood the problem and are failing to identify an effective solution. But again, if this is a means by which the government seeks to respond to public pressure about climate, I think that it fails, because it still involves a lot of despoiling and destruction of the earth.
Thank you. David, you said a lot on the housing already. Did you want to say anything about the budget's what it did for the climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, on the housing front, Chuka's totally right. I mean, we've totally abandoned non-market housing, right? I mean, this is one of the idea that housing is necessarily for someone's profit has been accepted wholesale. Whether that's a big developer, whether it's the mom and pop, whether it's just selling your house at more than you bought it 4 or 5 years ago, this has become the fundamental nature of housing. It is one of the best investment vehicles that any Canadian or company has ever seen in the company's history. You would have been foolish to invest money 10 or 20 years ago in a factory when you could have just bought real estate, because it's got a fabulous return. And this has been true for 20 years, been true for 25 years in Canada. And anybody who could afford to carry 2 mortgages or have a tenant carry a mortgage would be foolish to sell a house in a market like this, because the investment returns are so stellar. This is in part the productivity problem, is that you would be foolish to invest in productive assets when you could just invest in real estate. And we as a country have been very foolish not to continue to invest in non-market housing. In the 1980s, half of all rental construction was being paid for directly by CMHC, the federal government's housing provider. Half of all new builds was being funded by CMHC. That's not what's happening now. We've got 25 years of makeup months, 35 years of makeup time. And so there are, some initiatives that are limited that do attempt to move, either build new units in the non-market sector or move units from the for-profit sector to the non-market sector. But Chuka's absolutely right. They are limited. They are not the primary focus here. The primary focus is the creation of new rental units built by the private sector for private sector profit in the long term. I mean, there are some criteria for affordable housing and so on within those units, but it's limited. And that's the approach of this government. I mean, it'll have an impact. They will build more rental units. There'll be a lot more rental units 3-4 years from now than there are now. That will likely have an impact on average rents. Now, I mean, that is what it is. I mean, this is what the government's doing, but I mean, there is some value in that. I'm not saying it's the right approach. I mean, one of the big downfalls of this budget is exactly that it isn't focused on creating non-market housing, period. Not housing for the poor, not social housing for people who can't afford housing, but just housing that isn't governed by the needs of the market and the profit needs of the market. That's not happening. Well, that's happening in a very limited way, but in general, it's not happening. But on the environmental question, yeah, I mean, it was very limited in terms of specific measures in this budget. There was an addendum tax credit in this year's budget for EV supply chains that was somehow missed in last year's budget. It's in this year's budget. It's a bit of an addendum to what happened last year. Last year was really the tax credit budget. This is like massive tax gifts to companies that are investing in a whole variety of environmental supply chain issues that could pan out for us if it's not gamed to death by the corporate sector. It could also just be gamed to death by the corporate sector. And we pay out a whole bunch in tax credits and we get nothing for it. We get very limited payoff for it. The carbon tax rebate that is collected, from all of us and is being paid back to individuals will now be paid back to small business, which there's a fund that was being built up over time, and it will now be dispersed to small business. That's not really a surprise. I mean, they've been planning to do it for some time, but it did come out in this budget. It does highlight for me the incredible amount of money that's being collected by the carbon tax and it's just being paid right back out to people. And, I explain this to anybody who's not an economist, and they say, that makes no sense. Why are you taking all this money that we're paying on this carbon tax and just giving it right back to people? And you say, well, it's about incentives, incentivize. And they're like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I mean, there's definitely a case for a carbon tax rebate at lower income households because the tax incidence is going to be higher there because they spend everything that they make. But you could take 3/4 of what's being collected in a carbon tax rebate and make heat pumps on par with gas furnaces. You could make electric cars on par with gas cars and make an actual, tangible, immediate difference to people in their lives in terms of really shifting, because people, I think, legitimately want to make these shifts towards heat pumps and away from gas furnaces, towards electric cars and away from gas cars. But the upfront costs are really high. And so, this is a way that we could do that. Anyway, I mean, that's not what this budget is doing. It was just sort of highlighted by the fact that this carbon tax rebate came out for small business.
Okay.
They topped up the zero emission vehicle program because it chewed through its entire budget, which is positive. The other thing that chewed through its entire budget was the home retrofit program, which is an extremely popular program, but they cap it. They cap it, which is so ridiculous, right? Like if you're seeking the stock option deduction because you're a wealthy, CEO and you want your stock option deduction, there isn't like an amount of stock option deduction that once the budget is spent, you don't get stock option deductions anymore, right? Like, sorry, the budget ran out of money, you don't get your stock option deduction. But that is absolutely how it works for the home retrofit program. It just runs out of money, and you got to wait around for the next budget. And there's all this uncertainty about whether all these investments in windows and furnaces that you made will get, some sort of rebate and so on. Not how tax expenditures work for the wealthy, but absolutely how our retrofit programs work. And so the retrofit program is worth about $1 billion. The scale is utterly wrong here. We need to be spending $20 billion a year on retrofits for not only residential but also commercial stock. This is about $1 billion. It's not to say the Fed should be spending all of that, but the scale is just totally wrong here for the emergency that's coming out. And we could fund this through the carbon tax. We're collecting an insane amount of money through the carbon tax and then just moving it right back out. I mean, this is sort of the problem when economists take over. This is an economist's fever dream. This is such a perfect and efficient use of tax dollars as this rebate program. The trouble is, this is what happens when you separate political from economy, is you get programs that make great sense to economists, but in a political sense, that 10% of people that are now paying a lot more in carbon tax vote in a different party that cancels the carbon tax. And you totally ignore that fact when you separate politics from economics. It turns out they're tied in the end. And that's how we ended up with the carbon tax, unfortunately.
David, I'm going to jump in here because I'm keeping my eye on the clock here and realize we've got more questions and also questions from the audience. But just a quick comment on the housing comments that you've all made. Just want us to remember that the Liberals announced their so-called national housing strategy in 2017, which is now 7 years ago. And of course, housing has only increasingly worsened in Canada in terms of affordability, supply, and so on. So I do think that one huge question, we don't have to answer it today, I'm just putting it out there, is accountability. Like if we could paper a room with all of the press releases the Liberals have made about housing announcements, it would be quite something. And yet, do we really see the impact? Like, where are the units? Where are the people living in them? And particularly in not-for-profit. I mean, I agree with you, David, that we should see more rental housing coming on, but unless there are very strict parameters around the private sector and building those rental units, then basically they get sunsetted and they just return to, whatever the market will bear, right? So I do think, for me, because I've followed the housing story for decades now, a huge element of it is the accountability, is following the money. Where does the money go? So supposedly it goes to municipalities, supposedly it goes to First Nations, supposedly it goes to provinces, but does it, how do we actually look at the units that were produced and the actual people who are benefiting? So I'm going to leave that there, because I think we'll probably just move on to the next question, which I think is, it's actually me. It's actually coming back to you, David. We're actually giving you a bit of a longer view of budgets right now. All of you have been involved in previous budgets. And so, David, just a trip down memory lane, you were on our panel a couple of years ago, actually February 2022, when the government was about to release its budget. And at that time, you critiqued the federal government for not providing enough income support to workers by essentially returning to the inadequate employment insurance system that existed before COVID. So this is sort of taking us back to the COVID and pre-COVID days, and providing very little support to Canadians with disability or for single adults. So just really kind of want to get a quick reflection from you. Have subsequent budgets, including this one, made any progress in those critiques that you addressed now 2 years ago?
So there were substantial processes over the last year and a half, both for employment insurance reform and the creation of a Canada disability benefit. I expected that neither of them would yield a thing. And I was 50% right. There have been no changes on the EEI file. There was a minor extension, 5 weeks, sort of a seasonal EI top up in some regions in Atlantic Canada and Quebec, but that's very minor. But no real changes. We're not going back to CERB anytime soon, like that kind of approach. But, and this was a real surprise to me, there is a plan for a Canada disability benefit. Now, it's $2,400. It's terribly inaccurate. It's just far too small. The federal government, this is what the budget said, aspires for it to provide support like old age security and the guaranteed income supplement, which would be $20,000 a year, thereabouts. It provides $2,400 a year. So it's completely inadequate. That being said, it's the furthest we've ever gotten on a Canada disability benefit. And it has an implementation date, which is the summer of next year. So completely inadequate, but but less inadequate than nothing, I guess. And so I think it's an important step forward to have a program that's actually up and running. And that was a legitimate surprise in this budget, to me anyway.
Good. Okay. Back to you, Robin.
Great, thanks. All right, Chuka, question for you. As a panelist on Off the Hill in May of last year, you said politicians are less likely to take positions that will cost them an election. So is there anything in this budget that looks to you like it's more about trying to help the government get elected rather than trying to help Canadians?
Yeah, I mean, that I would say generally everything a government does is about trying to get reelected. And in particular, this isn't budget related, but in particular, I would say the government's continued complicity in Israel's genocide in Palestine is one about getting reelected, but then also reflective of their rank racism and cowardice. But I think in particular, at very least in regard to the Liberals anticipating competing against the Conservatives in an upcoming election, I imagine the things that you would look for to attempt to find evidence of like vote directed policy would be in key voting demographics, like young people and students, for example. And while there are measures, like for example, eliminating interest on student debt and things like that, there are measures that are directed at these groups, these demographic groups. I think more than anything, they just reveal the limits of the Liberals' imagination. It has always struck me as rather counterintuitive that you have to borrow money from the government to go to a university also owned by the government. And, certainly in terms of the specific budgeting and disparate contributors to various institutions, there's justifications for it. But ultimately, I think that particularly for young people who don't see much of a future, really, I mean, there are a lot of issues that governments throughout the West are not presenting serious responses to, or don't even necessarily identify as issues. And so things like this that have what I would characterize as half measures for key demographic groups that the Liberals would need to win overwhelmingly if they want to maintain access to government, if not maintain government. I think, it demonstrates the limits of their imagination, which I believe will increasingly be a problem as attitudes among younger voters, as more and more of them become voting age. I think their attitudes are far to the left of what the Liberals are willing to offer, at very least at the the polling stage.
Thanks, Chuka. And now a quick trip down memory lane for you, Jim. Last year, you gave testimony at the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance as part of its pre-budget hearings. And one of the things you told the committee were claims that the federal deficit has been a significant cause of Canada's recent inflation problem are not credible. And I know this has been a subject that you've really talked about at length in your columns and in the media, trying to debunk the myths about the deficit and inflation. So I guess the question for you is, can you explain sort of what you meant then and how that issue may have impacted yesterday's budget as well?
Well, thank you, Libby. I got to tell you, I'm a little worried now with this trip down memory lane motif that you guys are organizing. I got to be careful. I got to be careful what I say on this program in case it comes back to haunt me. Wow. Anyway,
we remember. Yeah.
Well, on this case, I am 100% right. So
yes, you are. I'm sure.
In that case, I'm glad to revisit it. Pierre Poilievre, of course, has been trying to pin anything that's wrong in Canada on Pierre Trudeau, including inflation. And he says inflation was caused because of government overspending during the pandemic, supported by the Bank of Canada's use as he calls it an ATM for government. Government just went to the ATM and got out all the cash to pay for those CERB benefits and everything else. And this is just frankly nonsense from a macroeconomic perspective. The surge in inflation after the COVID lockdowns ended was experienced globally. There is no correlation at all between the size of a country's deficit and the size of inflation that they had to experience. It was reflective of the enormous disruption in the global economy and supply chains and shortages and a very, very healthy dose of profit taking, where opportunistic companies took advantage of shortages, uncertainty, consumers who were desperate after the lockdown, and then all iced or supercharged by the energy price shock after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Which, by the way, was the single biggest contributor to inflation initially in Canada. Now it's housing. So, again, super profits in oil and gas, in housing and property development, and supermarkets, of course, have been a big part of the problem. An interesting fact to counter the Polyev story on this is just to compare Canada to the United States, two countries right next to each other. Both of them had inflation after the pandemic. The inflation has followed very, very similar tracks in the two countries. So have interest rates in the two countries, followed very, very similar tracks. The American federal deficit is literally, this is not an exaggeration, 10 times bigger than Canada's federal deficit as a share of GDP, not in dollars. Okay, of course, everything in the US is bigger in dollars than in Canada. But as a percent of GDP, it's literally 10 times bigger than it is in Canada, and yet their inflation and interest rates are virtually identical. So we could absolutely have a balanced budget, and we'd still be facing the same approximate inflation. The $40 billion deficit in the context of a national economy that's almost $3 trillion is irrelevant. It's a rounding error. Saying that it's putting pressure on the deficit is like saying a piece of paper is putting pressure on my table, right? It's not anything that you could possibly measure in the grand scheme of things. But again, Polyev and the Business Council and the C.D. Howe Institute and so on have all seized on this as a sign that the government is profligate. And their concern is what government is spending on, not that government is spending. They don't like what government is spending on. They don't like the baby steps towards a more inclusive economy that these budget measures represent.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody. All right. We're going to move on to some audience questions now. We got a few coming in. First is, okay, so in the budget, Canada is putting billions towards new defense spending, despite the impact war has on the climate. Right, so we just spoken about the climate. So thoughts? Why don't we go to Chuka, David, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what conflict the government imagines the Canadian military would be pivotal in deciding the outcome of, but I don't think that conflict exists. Notably as well, I think recent events demonstrate that should there be a significant international conflict, it's very likely Canada would be on what I would say is morally the wrong side. But ultimately, this seems that it's about like saving face in the NATO alliance or what have you, and maintaining relations primarily maybe with the US. But yeah, ultimately, Canada is comfortably within the United States security umbrella, such that I would say Canadian defense, quote unquote, or Canadian military expenses are largely for show. I don't, they talk about defending the Arctic. I mean, if you were to, Canada's not going to fight a war against Russia, certainly not successfully. And, again, the questioner is absolutely correct about the effects on the climate of war. And in that region, there's already warming that is greater than or more rapid than scientists had feared. So I believe it's like politically, I would say it's theater more so than anything else. I'm fundamentally opposed to standing militaries, so that is a context for my views. But also, I think that it's a misuse of those resources, and that they're much more important emergencies to address. And I don't see any indication that Canada is soon to be invaded.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. David?
Yeah, I mean, it is worth comparing in terms of international relations. We've got $10 billion in new defense spends over the next 5 years. About 2 of that's for Ukraine. The other 8 is for a variety of, Arctic sovereignty and that sort of thing. Compare that to the increase in development spending, right? So you've got $10 billion in defense, and you've got about $600 million in development. So just a big difference in priorities internationally in terms of how do we interact with the world? What's important to us? Is it more important to us to hit the 2% of GDP NATO goal, or is it more important for us to hit the 0.7% of GNI development goal? Clearly, the defense goal is more important, right? And when it comes to international relations, we're spending as if that's far more important. It's a very lopsided spend. One of the things in our alternative budget, certainly for new spends for the war in Ukraine, was to match that on the other side with development. Not necessarily in Ukraine, but elsewhere in the world. That's not what this budget does. And this is, I haven't looked at this, but this is likely one of the biggest defense spend budgets in a long time. It makes a major change in our defense expenditures.
Thanks. Jim?
Oh, I can't add to the great remarks of Chuka and David on that.
Okay.
Awesome.
All right. Well, that's good. It gives us a little bit more time to get to other questions. So another question that's come in is there seems to be a pullback on support for entrepreneurship, in particular women entrepreneurs. Since 2016, the government has only spent $8 billion on equalizing opportunity. Any of you have any sort of history on that or any thoughts on it in terms of support for entrepreneurship, particularly for women? Yes, David.
It isn't particular to women, but it was a big change in this budget. There's a massive new capital gains exemption for entrepreneurs. They haven't defined that specifically in the budget. It'll likely be for things like tech and such. But if you are selling shares in a small business or farm, this capital gains change is that it has increased. The inclusion rate has increased for people declaring $250,000 in capital gains. At the same time, if you're selling a small business, you can now declare an extra $2 million in capital gains at a much lower inclusion rate. And this is the first time we've seen this lower inclusion rate for entrepreneurs. There's a zero inclusion rate for selling shares in a small business. That was also increased. We're now at, you can sell $3.25 million worth of a business in sort of an entrepreneurial sense, a tech startup, and pay little or no tax at all. And this is a substantial change in this budget. I mean, the corporate, the business press is saying, oh, it's going to hurt entrepreneurship. And you're like, $3 million is a pretty big exemption. And that's for an individual person. If you had 10 people, which is how it's set up, and they each had shares in a company that you sold, you could sell a company at a $30 million profit and pay little to no income tax on that after this year's budget. I mean, that is a lot of money. That's a major tech sale to a big company like Microsoft or Google, and as a result of this budget. And so, this is a major new support for entrepreneurial sales of budget, which goes in the exact opposite direction. It's kind of an offset in a sense to this increase in capital gains for richer Canadians. And I think well worth pointing out when people say, oh, it's going to hurt entrepreneurship and so on. Insofar as entrepreneurs do something because they're going to get a tax rebate on it, which I don't think they do. I think they do it because, they're interested in this issue, and if the tax rate was higher, it wouldn't make any difference. But, insofar as tax rates govern anything, the exemptions are massive for tech entrepreneurs at this point and after this budget. I'm not even necessarily in favor of it, but the business community loves this sort of stuff. But that's important to point out, I think, in this budget. Okay. Any thoughts from you, Jim, on this question of entrepreneurship, or Chuka?
I would just say very quickly that I know that David wrote extensively throughout the sort of first years of the pandemic on its specific impact on working women throughout the country. And you would think that given the Liberal Party has presented itself as progressive on issues of gender and gender inequality so frequently and so consistently throughout their time in government, that they would make or more significant or make a bigger deal about the amount of investment that they were putting in. So if that investment isn't there, perhaps it's because they don't feel any pressure for that voting group in comparison to Polyev, but I don't know.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we've got time for just one more very quick question before we wrap up tonight. And that's a question of coming in from people in terms of how this budget looks in positioning itself towards an election. I mean, now that you've seen the budget from yesterday, and you've been generally positive about a number of things, but noting that there's no structural changes, and that there are other things that could have easily have been done that would have been very significant. But how does it look to you in terms of leading into an election year, and how do you sort of see that as economists, as political commentators? Is this like a pre-election budget that we're seeing here? Jim, why don't we start with you?
Oh, you're absolutely right, Libby. That's a good term for it. It isn't an election budget because we will have one more budget before the election, assuming that the NDP Liberal deal continues on, which I think is a safe bet. But it is absolutely a pre-election budget. The Liberals have been motivated by these terrible poll numbers that they've been facing, and Poilievre's surge in support among many segments of society, even young people, which is very, very disappointing. So I think that this was all about trying to engineer a recovery and Liberal support. And it, to some extent, it may work. I really like the contrast between the incremental but concrete improvements that have been offered in these different areas versus Poilievre's ad nauseum banging on about the deficit. And, only people who accept the economic underpinnings of Poilievre's argument will see anything in that. From a perspective of managing a household, that's a totally abstract issue. Whether the deficit's big or small doesn't affect my ability to pay the bills next month. So I think that is a good contrast. That could be a good ballot question. From the NDP's perspective, because they've had so much influence, so much visible influence on so many of the good things, I would love to see them get more success and more credit for that. And I know it's very tricky to negotiate the politics of a supply and confidence arrangement, that you're keeping the government in power at the same time as you're challenging them to do better. But I do think the NDP really deserves some decent credit for the good things that we see in this budget.
Okay, and just very quickly from David and Chuka, if you've got any sort of last comment around that, just very quickly, like 30 seconds each.
I mean,
David,
I'd say that this could be an election budget in a pinch if it had to be. It's certainly ambitious on the housing front, but it's not only ambitious on the housing front. It is pushing in other areas, and certainly the bad poll numbers, I think, really focused the minds of the Liberals that they needed to continue to push the envelope. To Jim's point, I think it's tough for the NDP to vote this down. The agreement between the NDP and the Liberals yielded important and hopefully long-term changes, particularly on the healthcare file, on pharma, on dental. I mean, these are legitimately new programs that will, well, dental at least will likely survive the next election. Pharma may not because it's a little bit too close, but in any event, I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, David. And Chuka, last word to you. How do you see this in terms of the election?
I would say it's certainly a pre-election budget as opposed to an election budget because there aren't any pictures of Poilievre squinting without glasses on. So.
Okay, good one to end on. Well, I just want to say that's all the time we've got for questions today. And thank you so much to Jim, David, and Chuka. You guys are very informative and knowledgeable. And I think it really helps us sort of understand what's underneath the budget and where it's headed. So I really want to thank you for your contributions today. And I know that we'll be talking to you again about another federal budget, probably the election one. So our live political panel on Off the Hill will return next month. And as a reminder, we now have a regular day set for this series, so you can join us for Off the Hill every third Wednesday of the month, which means our next Off the Hill will happen Wednesday, May 15th. And for sure, if folks have ideas for topics you want to see, you can always put them in the chat or contact Rebel and give us ideas of what you'd like to see discussed. But be sure to get an invitation for that event by signing up for Rebel's newsletter at rabble.ca/subscribe. And finally, a pretty special note, actually. Did you know that tomorrow Rebel is celebrating 23 years of publishing? Now, I got to tell you, that is remarkable for online, progressive, independent, reader-supported media. It's a struggle. It has been a struggle, but it is alive and kicking and still there, and we hope will go on for many more years. So I want to put a special shout out to help celebrate Rabble's birthday. Please visit Rabble's donation page and show your appreciation and your support by making a donation. And to give a special shout out to the team at Rabble. Just tonight on Off the Hill, we have Browne Doyle, who's the managing editor of Rabble. We have Nick Seabram, who's the editor. We have Jace Tanner, who does the tech. That's the team here tonight. And Browne and Nick are sort of on it every day, and they have a team with them too. So, really a shout out to them for all of their dedicated work, for keeping Rabble going strong, giving this commentary, not just on Off the Hill, but the columns, the articles, the podcasts, the reviews. This is all very important to us as Canadians to have another perspective than what we read in the corporate media. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And we'll see you next month on Off the Hill, Wednesday, May 15th. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.